and she does glass work and copper sculpture. And this is the first time she's been in Hamilton Street Gallery, and we're happy to have her. Okay, so how did you get started making art, and why did you choose three-dimensional work?
It's a very good question. Well, I probably started early in my lifetime. As a young child, I remember walking, well, I lived in Piscataway, and I used to walk to the river with my dad. We used to take, long walks. And once we got to the river, he would find the banks full of clay. So we'd pull out some of the clay, and I would take it home. I was probably maybe 6, 7 years old, and make little saucers and cups and bowls for my doll and my cat. So that's how I guess I started.
Was your father an artist too?
No,
Okay.
It was a chicken farm.
we had a chicken farm.
Oh, that's
But my parents were always taking me to a museum if we went to the city or something like that. So I had, growing up, open to different types of art. When I was a little older, of course I had a career of teaching in Howard Park, but I never taught art. I had reading, I taught in English as a second language, and
What grade did you teach?
I started with kindergarten, moved to first grade for 3 years. Then I took a hiatus of 10 years to raise a family. And I returned and I taught reading.
Were you doing art in between those times?
Yes, I was. I was always involved with a class. And I remember when my children were young, like 2, 4, and 6 years old, in the middle of the winter, and their noses were running, and I was at wit's end. My mom came over one day and she said, "Ellen, you just have to get out." And I said, "But how can I? I have 3 kids to take care of. My husband is working." And she said, "Well, I'm going to come over. You pick a class. I'll come over, watch the kids, and we go out for one evening." And I was very fortunate. There's a local Y. At that time it was the JCC, and then it changed to Y. But George Siegel, the sculptor, was the teacher. And it was when he was painting. He hadn't done any three-dimensional work at all, but he was a really wonderful painter. And I came every Tuesday night with my box of paints and canvases, and I went to my class with George. And it was probably the turning point of my life. A few things happened. He actually taught me how to see,
Right.
how to look at everything, your whole environment, and you get something from it. You just don't pass by without retaining something. The other thing is he also taught me the wonderful effects of music. And while we were in the class and drawing and painting and that kind of thing, he played very unusual music.
Like, what do you mean by unusual?
Gregorian chants,
Oh.
which he loved, and Bach he loved, and Mozart he loved, and opera he loved. So I therefore not only got a nice art education, but I got a musical education as well. I stayed with him for 10 years. We had shows at the end of class sessions and that kind of thing. And then one day, one of the people in the class, whose husband worked for J&J in New Brunswick, was working on a new type of plaster roll that is used for quick setting arm fractures or leg fractures. And
Would you explain what that stuff is
I
made
will.
of? Oh,
Hold on. The plaster came in rolls, and it was gauze infiltrated with plaster, pieces of plaster.
Okay.
And we proceeded to experiment with it, with these rolls. You cut off a piece of the roll and dip it in warm water and place it on an elbow, a chin, a face, a hand, a wrist, whatever you want to do.
Is this the first time that you were doing then the three-dimensional type
Yes.
of work? And is the first time George Siegel was as well?
George had started just a little bit before that, and he was working with burlap and plaster.
Okay.
But his figures were very heavy, and he just was not happy with that medium. He was looking for
Something lighter.
lighter.
Mhm.
And these rolls came around and were being manufactured by Johnson & Johnson. And we all were experimenting and playing with it. And, we took our little projects home. George took the rest of all the rolls home. And his wife, Helen, decided with George that she would cast him. So she did.
Was she an artist too?
No,
Oh.
she was a supporter of the
Okay.
arts, helping him along. But what happened was, she put all these plastic gauze rolls on him. George was very, very hairy. He had hair all over his body. At that time, we didn't know about Vaseline, which should be applied first. So I remember George telling the story after this was completed. He said it was the most painful thing that he has ever experienced in his life, because every hair from his body had to be cut by hand to release the plaster. And they were cut in sections. After that, he became very familiar with Vaseline, as we all did. And what happened with his career is it was launched then. He never had to sell his work. However, somebody from the Castelli Gallery saw his work, and from his chicken coops in South Brunswick, went straight directly to New York City.
Wow.
George never had to sell anything. George also was very good in photography. He drew very well. He did, very large portraits of his family and things that he, was close.
Did he ever cast you? Or?
No, I offered many times.
Okay.
But he always had very young, beautiful bodies to work with, or older ones. And he has, he has the bread line in ground sculpture.
Right.
He has the Holocaust in San Francisco. And in my travels, and I've been to Europe and a few other countries, every time I go to a museum, there's always something of George's. So it just makes me feel wonderful.
Yeah,
And I
you were
was
right there.
honored to have him as a teacher for that length of time. And even later on, when I would meet him at a movie or the grocery store or something like that, he always said, "Oh, Ellen, what are you doing now?" And I would tell him, he says, "Do you have any pictures?" And I sometimes had. "Oh, that's good," and he always encouraged me and other students as well. So much for that wonderful career.
So then you got started three-dimensionally, and then how did you get
Well,
into
not quite yet. I took lots of craft classes. I took a class in jewelry making, and I took a class in paper making. And about 27 years ago, I had a show in a large building in New Brunswick, and I sold about 25 pieces out of that show, which was really very exciting. Very large pieces, and I gently kind of molded, so I'm beginning to come into a 2 or 3 dimensional. And I continued taking silk screen classes and basket classes, and I always say I recycle my skills, because even though I make glass now and I do sculpture now, the skill that I learned in making jewelry, I now know how to solder well. Or my compositions always go back to what George said. So it's a nice thing to know I've accumulated some of those skills to continue my artwork.
When you design something, do you write it down, make a sketch?
Sometimes I do. Sometimes I just play with the forms and move them till I get a comfortable, appealing composition, and then I will stop and then actually put it together. And then when I was teaching, the last year of my teaching, which was 35 years at Holland Park, I had a computer lab. But even then, I did a lot of artistic things with the kids. They would draw and paint using the computer. There was a program, I don't remember the name of it, one of the painting programs. So they would write their stories on the computer, but they would always include one of their pictures that they made. And we later published a book. At that time, I had received a grant from the town to work with senior citizens, to bring seniors into the school system so that they know what's really going on. And in turn, the children asked for their biographies, and the children interviewed the seniors, and we, out of that, ultimately came a hardcover book with all the histories of these older folks who usually turn down budgets. We're now so pro-school.
Yes.
That was our mission also. And then after I retired, I took classes at Middlesex County College in sculpture, and I learned how to use all the large machinery, and some of the projects that we made had to be large outdoor pieces, and I used either wood or metal. And I also I took my first welding class here in Bound Brook.
Did you?
At the Bound Brook High School welding class.
Wow, when was that?
That was many years
it's not
ago.
like that now.
It was an evening school,
Okay.
a night school.
That's
and
nice.
I went one day a night, and I learned how to weld. Some of my pieces on my lawn have internal rebar in them, and they had to be welded, so I was able to do that.
Describe how you do your glass pieces.
Sure.
Like, what are the different types of glass?
I've always, first of all, I've always loved glass. I love the feel of glass, I love the look of glass, and I'm always looking for new ways to present glass. I've done vessels more recently, and my compositions are usually taken from nature. I visit Maine every summer, and I just am overwhelmed with the sight of the moon, the large full moon on a beautiful summer day. Either that one or this one.
And that one.
Yes, and I've made them in larger pieces as well. And just the landscape is just beautiful. But I try not to do it exactly like I see it, but rather get the impression of what I see. And when I prepare a piece of glass, and by the way, I have a studio in my basement, which makes it very convenient. I have my own kiln as well. For the flat pieces, I have to first take a piece of clear glass, cut that out, and then I take, if it's one color like the yellow and the black, then I will cut the yellow sheet out and then cut the strips of the black.
So you just hand cut them?
Hand cut.
Okay.
With
a glass cutter?
Glass cutter,
Okay.
yes. And then I gently glue them in place. It goes into the kiln, and the temperature goes up to about 1450 to 1500. And it takes at least 12 or 18 hours for the kiln to cool down so that I can open it. And every time I open it, I get a great surprise. It's just so exciting. You put it in at night or in the day, whenever you put it in, but the next morning, or the next time I can open it, it's just, you know, I hope as I open the kiln that it'll be a good fire. Sometimes it's not. I've had accidents as well. But for the most part, it's just a thrill to open the kiln and find.
So even though you design it and write it down and everything, you
Yeah.
still like the spontaneity of
Yes.
what can happen?
Yes,
Yeah,
because it really looks quite different, flat
right.
or on a table,
Right.
compared to when you open the kiln and see how everything kind of fuses and melts together.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you feel you're better at developing the glass now than when you started? Are you gaining an
Yes,
acumen?
yes, I am. And as a matter of fact, after I went to Middlesex for 2 years, they shipped me out and said, you can't teach anything more here. So they sent me to Rutgers, and I audited sculpture classes at Rutgers, and I was also very happy to have some of the very best teachers there. I had, for clay, I had Peter Callis, and for sculpture, I had Ruby Serra, whose brother is Richard Serra. And in fact, I just mailed the YouTube of the opening here to Rudy, and he called me, he said, I liked it, he says, but Ellen, he said, what happened to your 3D sculpture? Because all of these pieces are flat, except the vessels. And he said to me exactly what I have been feeling for the last month or two. And I am now in the process, my head is spinning all the time, to make glass in a sculptural way. So I was in the basement yesterday and I found 2 clay molds that I had made. And now I'm ready to try to make glass sculpture in 3 dimensions.
Okay.
So it's always a process, and I learn from each thing that I do. But I find it's like the center of my life that I find so exciting.
Do you still do the copper sculptures? Or?
Yes, I do. These actually. Which one's the other one?
There's one in the window.
Oh yeah, the one in the window won first prize in the county 3 years ago, and third prize place in the state for sculpture.
Okay.
This one was the second year, first place in the state, county, and also third place in the state. And I have, and this one, this year I got an honorable mention.
Stormy Love.
Stormy Love.
Stormy
yeah.
Love, yes.
So I still love to go back to copper. I find it really a wonderful metal to work with. It's easy enough for me to work it. It's not, I can manage the tools to cut and solder.
How did you get the gradations in color with this copper?
Well, the 2 things. The texture, this is a funny story. The texture is made, I was thinking, how can I get an even texture on a big sheet 4x8 somehow? And my car has large tires. I took the sheet down to the park in Hyde Park, and at that time, this was a few years ago, the gravel parking lot was the perfect answer. Put the sheet down, it was a rainy day, I put the sheet down on the ground, and I ran my car tires back and forth, and I got this wonderful texture, which is, in here and in here. And then the color gradation is done with a torch, and I actually call it painting with fire. But I can do it here, and I can do it here, and my lady has some also. So it's not just flat shiny color.
How long did it take you to do this?
That was a project that represented in about 3 months,
Okay.
a semester.
Okay.
Yeah. In fact, I didn't have a studio at that time. I used my dining room table, and I had this 4x8 sheet. I had to cut it out. Nobody was able to come to the house for 4 months. But it was a lot of fun making it, and she's my favorite lady.
See, why did you make it so large? And are you like, is it a like feminist statement in any way?
Well,
or?
yes, both.
Okay.
Large because Rudy would not accept anything small. Rudy Serra was my teacher who pushed us. And he would say always, I don't care how you make it, just make it, and we'll worry about having to put it somewhere another time. So in other words, it didn't have to have a base like a lot of sculptures have. It's like it comes from the earth and it comes up. And what was your other question about that?
If there was any kind
yes.
of feminist statement.
I call it I Am Woman.
Yeah,
It's named after Helen Reddy's song, I Am.
right.
And I'm not exactly a staunch feminist, but I certainly am very concerned with women's rights in politics and education and health and all the other things. But I felt that was my best statement I could make for women.
Okay. Let's see here. What other factors in your life have influenced your art, like your family or your career, or that have changed your way of thinking about art?
Well, I think I mentioned mostly it was George's encouragement and clear understanding of, for me, what art is. And it's so widely defined, broadly defined, I would say. Each person takes from a piece of art what they want. And when somebody says, oh, I see a dragon or I see a horse, I said, well, that's good. I can't argue with that. That's what they see. But that's acceptable too, and it's not what I really intended for it to be, but if somebody feels that, that's fine.
Tell us about the
Oh.
left piece in the back there.
Yes, that's Blowing in the Wind, and this is another story. Many years ago, we had a friend who was a writer for the New York Post and the New York Star Ledger. His name was Alfred Aronowitz, and he was his job to write was to interview brand new people in the entertainment world, mostly singers or instrumentalists. And we were at his house this one day in the winter, and he said, hey, come on in, I want you to meet my friend. And his name is Bob. And I said, okay, and he yells out, hey Bobby, come on in. And it was Bob Dylan. And Bob Dylan said, hey, gruffy, skinny, bearded, just the way he looks almost today, I guess, only a little older, younger at that time. So he says, hey, I just finished this song, would you like to hear it? And he said, sure. And he plays Blowing in the Wind.
For the first time?
For the very first time.
Wow.
And he was probably just 17 years old at the time. And so I used that Blowing in the Wind theme for this piece of glass and perhaps 2 or 3 other sculptures, because it was a very significant time for me. Yes.
Have you ever tried glass blowing?
Yes, I have. I took a class at near Raton Valley. It's called Vandermark. And I did try it. It's difficult in that you have to be with somebody all the time, and I would only get small things, And I thought I would go and blow something, you know, really big, and that can't happen for years because it's such a skill and it takes so long to learn. You know, I made a small vessel and I made a couple of paperweights, but that's not really what I want to do. I really want to make glass three-dimensional, and I'm now on my way, I think. So maybe in a few months.
Talk about the fountain.
Oh, yes, I had, two years ago, I had a commission to make an indoor water fountain in a building in New Brunswick at the Heldrick Center on the far side, which is the Rutgers University Department of Workforce Development. And they wanted something large, 7 feet, and height was 7 and 8 in the middle. So I made a few sketches, and I started out with copper.
Oh, okay.
But copper was not the right material for that place. It was a very contemporary lobby, blues and greens, and before I even started, I said I need to switch materials. So I hired a young man to help me, and we decided to go with acrylite, which is a form of plastic.
Oh,
And it comes in 4 by 8 sheets.
okay.
And then we worked together cutting the sheets into 3 inches long. And then 2 of us, he would be on one side, I would be on the other, and we would clamp one of these panels, or one of these strips, which was 8 feet high, and into a clamp, a vise on the floor. And the only place I was able to work horizontally like this was in my den that had a skylight. So, you know, I put plastic on the floor and it stood upright. And he would be on one side with the heat gun, and I was on the other side. And I would start, and then he would.
So that's how you got the wavy
Yes,
effect?
and then we got it.
Okay.
It's on my website if
It's
you
beautiful.
actually want to take a look at it.
It's really, I've seen
If you Google my name, you can. It'll
So do
come
you
up.
picture yourself making glass pieces in a similar,
I would
like
love that
sculptural?
if I could do that.
how could that happen?
I would have to buy a foundry. I think.
So that piece is in the Heldrick?
Yes, the piece is in the Heldrick Center, and it's a water fountain, so it has a stainless steel structure, and you know, it's 12 inches wide, but it goes up 7 feet, and then 8 feet is an arc, and the center, and we had to build a big pool, what do you call it, container, so that the water, you know, goes in. And so there's a center pipe, and the pipe pumps up the water, and then it comes out at the top onto rods of stainless steel that I had to
And
weld.
it trickles down.
And it trickles down all through these wavy,
It's very
light
graceful,
blue
yes.
and green
Great.
pieces of acrylite. And it's, are you looking for a home?
I
But-
work like a block away from there, so I have to
Oh,
stop
really?
in
Oh,
next
sure.
week.
Go in through the New Street entrance.
The new street, yeah?
New Street entrance, and then go to the second floor, and it's in the lobby.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's been in working order. And
Your work is like so beautiful, and it's like, you know, just so pure in its expression. What do you think of the type of work that's going on today in comparison?
In New York City, I have visited many of the galleries. And even, let's see, I was in Rudy maybe 6 or 8 years ago or longer. And we would take day trips into the city to see what's going on. Oftentimes we would walk into the gallery, gander quick and out. And we agreed that the level of work is pretty terrible. I mean, not that I'm an artistic snob, but there's no concern about how a piece is finished. It's drippy, which I can accept sometimes, but not the whole thing drippy. There's no contrast. And it just seems haphazard, unthought through, and very disappointing. And Rudy said, because he left after Rutgers didn't rehire, they were cutting back on classes. And Rudy said, we really have to wait until the next ism comes along.
Is that gonna happen?
Well, we're still waiting because, it's Fauvism and it's Impressionism.
Yeah.
But it was a period in the art field or the art world that was recognizable. I don't know what's recognizable in today's.
Yeah.
And when you see some of these,
It's harder for artists today, I think.
oh,
too.
I'm sure
It's
it
very
is.
hard.
Yeah, when your daughter is an artist.
Yes.
But what I see and what I see is sold floors me. $200,000 for I don't know what. It's just not what I feel
So
comfortable.
what advice would you have for younger artists? Like, if you had to, what would you?
Make sure you have another career on the side. I was fortunate I was teaching, and I always did this on the side. Now that I'm retired, I can do it full time, but it's not something that I have to support myself with.
Right.
So a young person going in, Rutgers has cut back on the arts. They used to have 4 or 5 sculpture teachers. I think now they have 1 or 1.5.
They cut their performance out.
But some of the performance arts.
Yeah.
They cut out the complete ceramic department. Rutgers had been known for all over the country for the wonderful ceramic program. So in our economy as we are living now, I can't see how
Artists seem to be on their own more.
on their own.
They're on their own.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I can't see where that's going to change until perhaps the economy changes and people realize that our culture depends on art. What do you have from a culture if you don't have art? You don't have its writing, you don't have its artwork, you don't have its music. Really, so.
You've got Republicans.
That we got plenty.
Yeah.
Too many of
We'll
them.
bury them. Dig them up.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that's probably pretty thorough. Any questions?
Yeah. Who are some of your favorite artists? Doesn't have to be contemporary.
Okay, well, most of them are contemporary because I really do love contemporary art. Not so far that I don't understand it, but I think in the beginning when Louise Nevelson started, just collecting old stuff, putting it together seemed wonderful. And I love Giacometti, slender things, and Kiki Smith, and
There's an optimism.
yes, and I only wish I can live as long as Louise Bourgeois. She was in her 90s and she was still working, and I hope to do that too.
I think you did a pretty good job there. Okay, so I think so.
Okay, Bill, I'll take
Thank you
some
so
of
much.
Thank you.